Strawn, who's going to speak on a geometry of the aperspectival world.
Greetings. First of all, let me say I'm so excited to be here. You might be able to relate to. Just really has changed my life in the last couple of years, and brought to fruition many ideas that I've been kind of exploring.
Mike, can you use the mic?
No, I can't use the mic.
No? Okay.
I gotta be free.
Okay.
Be loud.
Just talk loud.
Louder. And so what I'd like to do today is take you on a journey, tell you a story, a geometric story, and more specifically, I want to take this object right here, the square, and dethrone it, or bring it into transparency for what it really is and where it really came from. You don't have to take my word for it. Hopefully it will be something that you see for yourself. And I'd like to point out as we go how the square and, in general, rectilinearity is ubiquitous in our world. Look around you. It's in our thought, deeply embedded in our geometric conceptions of space. And as a consequence, is reifying this dualism of ego and world, or self and world. And so my hope is that by teasing out more of its origin, that dualism will fall away. You be the judge. But to get us started, how about a few quotes from a good man? However we may wish to define it, irrationality is never identifiable with irrationality or pre-rationality. There is a fundamental distinction between the attempt to go beyond the merely measurable, knowing and respecting it while striving to be free from it, and rejecting and disregarding the measurable by regressing to the immoderate and unfathomable chaos of the ambivalent and even fragmented polyvalence of psychic and natural relations. Projective geometry has long since demonstrated that the rejection of measurability can by no means be equated with chaos. That sentence right there, that's what did it for me. And what do our task, and more specifically my task right now, which the new mutation poses for us, can be resolved only if we supersede the purely mental spatial world of systemic thought. We achieve this by recognizing the validity of systasis and moving the efficacy of the non-categorical elements into the sphere of perceptibility. So my goal is to bring certain things into your sphere of perceptibility. Finally, anyone who is at home in the three-dimensional coordinate system whose enclosure affords him security will find our deliberations unwelcome. Some might even be indignant. I trust that that's not you. But what emerges in indignation, if not the rationally restrained psychic constant? So though you may not become indignant as we proceed, you might become something. So if you could pay attention to the psychic eruptions.
Cubes at you.
Yeah. Feel free, I'll hide from that. Okay, so without further ado, once upon a time, there was chaos. This is our first image we need to explore a little bit. I'm inviting you with this image to imagine a plane, not space just yet, but we'll go there. A plane that is riddled with points and lines beyond count.
Two-dimensional or flat?
Two-dimensional, you're in a plane. But this is just meant as a indication of an idea that here we have indescribable, immeasurable, uncountable potential of all lines and all points that could exist in the plane. I just drew them randomly. If they were all there, it would be a solid white sheet. If they were all gone, it would be darkness. Right? So here we're sort of somewhere between the totality of the all-present and the non-present. So out of this, what I want to show is the square is connected to this. So as we proceed, everything we do, you could keep this image in the back of your mind as ever present in our deliberations. So out of that chaos, we can tease out 4 lines, or 2 pairs of lines. And any 2 pairs of lines are going to intersect in 2 points, such as that. And to demonstrate that, watch as it returns back into the chaos. Perhaps you can still see where it was. And you can maybe exercise, can you find 4 lines now and see what happens as a consequence? Here's another one. In this case, though, we see that the points where those lines intersect are off the page. So we're engaging now in a nonsensical, in the sense that you can't see those points, yet you are still capable of being aware that they exist. I hope you don't doubt that these lines intersect, even though you can't see them. And again, we could always return this to chaos. But now, let's see how these 4 lines relate to each other. We see that there's these 2 points. Now we're bringing them onto the page so we can be aware of them. And these 2 points then could account for any number of sets of generations of 4-lined structures. Here's another one. Here's another one. I could go on. I'd probably end up in a rather chaotic state like before, but so to forego that inevitability, there's actually a little technique we can do, which is to identify one of these and realize that this line that joins these points, which we'll draw in, exists, and on that line we can place a point that functions as a diagonal in this 4-line structure. And given this point, which can serve as sort of a harmonic relationship inducing or generating point, we can then draw a diagonal here and a diagonal to over there. And from here we have new intersections, which could then give birth to new 4-lined shapes. Imagine this being continued out, and we'd have a whole network of harmoniously related 4-lined units. And here I want to point out that there's a certain quality of expansion and contraction taking place. No 2 of these 4 lines are identical, yet they're all lawfully related to the same, in this case, 3 generative elements. But yet we see that these intervals, as we move down any one line, is in a state of expansion or contraction, depending on how you look at it. And towards that point, towards that point. Now, what happens then, as we saw before, these points don't have to be on the page. They can be off the page, or sheet, in our case. But again, there's still the lawful existence of that point that's on this line. Now, what if we take that point a little further? Really far. Really, really far. Now, we have thrust that point out to an infinite location. So now we are in the state of where the truest things we can say are paradoxical about infinite elements. Here's Gebser's take on it. Despite the irrational element, it, according to paradoxical thinking, nevertheless withstands a determined critique of perspectival thinking, which it takes beyond the fixed perspectival point. This can be illustrated on a geometric thesis known as the axiom of parallels. It states that 2 parallel lines meet or intersect at infinity. So here, it's a very interesting moment, and yet it's still, we could relate this back to the chaos. Any single one of these 4 lines is still related and can be arisen out of that chaos. But one thing that's worth pointing out here is that now these intervals between these lines are actually now regular. They are the same. This distance, to this distance, to this distance, and this distance. Likewise, in any one of these lines that we see the introduction of regularity, which was not present before, and to a certain respect could not have been present were there not one of these points put at infinity. Now, the difficulty with grokking the notion of two parallel lines intersecting at infinity is that on the one hand, and Gebser describes this, that if we ascribe it as a point on this line that has a location, then we are rationalizing it. But we need to be aware that the point is in that direction and it's simultaneously in that direction. So that is paradoxical. The rational structure doesn't allow for statements such as that. Nor could we rationalize measurements at infinity, even though it somehow introduces the quality where we are now. Likewise, many times when we think about this, there's a circular tendency to want to imagine that that point goes that way and somehow circles around and comes back. But that's not the whole truth either, because there's no curving taking place. But there's a quality of curvature, of circularity, which Gebser indicates that there's the blending of the oceanic, the mythic, cyclic thinking, or awareing, with a rational locating thinking. So that's the state that we have to enjoy if we're going to really take in what's happening out there. But furthermore, this is unique because this is the fundamental geometry of linear perspective. Here we have a study for the Adoration of the Magi by Leonardo da Vinci. And you can see that the fundamental ground plan here, the geometry at work, is identical to what we just saw. So now, here's a case in point of a more defined perspective drawing, famous one. And here's a case prior to that when such location had not yet been achieved. So here, somehow, you're able to see up to the ceiling and down to the table at the same time. Okay, so you couldn't say you are at one definite location in this picture as an observer. So it's linear perspective which accomplishes this, which places you, the observer, as well as the observed, in a fixed and defined location. We've got a quote here that says something to that effect. The take home here is that it locates and determines the observer as well as the observed. The positive result is the concretion of man in space. The negative result is the restriction of man to a limited segment where he perceives only one sector of reality. Now, we go back to this drawing here and imagine what would happen if this line disappeared off our page. And then it would look something like that, where there is still a convergence of those lines somewhere up top, but it's still in perspective, you could say. But if we take that line that contains both of those points and put the line at infinity, then this is what we have. So now we have regularity in all directions, or basically in the plane, in every direction of the plane. All the units are identical, uniform, static, isomorphic, homogeneous. And now there's been a translocation of the viewer, the observer, you, me, to nowhere, actually. Whereas before, even in this example, you can imagine a horizon line up there. We're located in space at a fixed point. But in this case, there is no relationship. There's no expansion and contraction. There's just regular, the same wherever you go. And presumably, if you were to travel in this plane in any direction for infinitely far away, you would just see this forever. There is no getting out of this according to the rational structure. Now, if we zoom out of this, we get something like that. It's a piece of graph paper. So underlying this is the Cartesian coordinate system. This Cartesian coordinate system is predicated on the location of those generative elements at infinity. Here then is the unit of that structure, which then we truncate, we kind of disaware the lines that generate this 4 line, which again, born out of chaos. And we end up with just this structure, the square. Look down, look up, you'll see it everywhere. And so what I'm trying to tease out, and we're going to go now into the 3rd dimension, but I'm trying to bring to your awareness that this square doesn't actually exist in isolation. We've just sectorized it. We've neglected the infinite elements that are co-emergent with the existence of the square. To kind of establish that, here's the square I started with. Here's that same square back in chaos. It's just one example, one simple case of the general case of 4 lines intersecting. So let's take now this cube and see how it transforms, or rather, the square into a cube. So what I'd like to do is demonstrate that by drawing something similar. So here we have a 4-line structure. I'm sorry it's so low. Trust me, I'm not happy about it either. But now, if I find that diagonal point right here, which is going to be our harmonizing agent, and I define this 4 line here, and if I use this same point to harmonically create another one anywhere I want, in this case I'm going to put it here, and I'm going to put this point, say right here. Okay, so now I have to use this point as my diagonal to connect these together. So the next point will go here. Don't worry if you're not following this. But this point has to go where that intersection was. And I now have a second one. Okay. In some respects unrelated to the first, not next to it per se, but still oriented on the same points. Now the amazing thing about this, and let me point out, I haven't measured, I'm not calculating, I'm not using any formulas, just exploring the relationships that arise when we bring these elements into relationship. So notice that now if I connect corresponding edges, and I did this very accurately, which is hard to do when you're using chalk and being very fast, turns out that all of those edges, which are now defining our little cubic shape, all converge to meet in a single point. So I didn't know that was going to happen, but you didn't. So there's a hidden lawfulness that wasn't necessarily here from the outset, at least to our observation. And so, this is an example of projective geometry wherein we are exploring the lawfulness that isn't predicated on any perspective that we take. What I'm trying to argue is that the fixed perspectival relationship of Cartesian geometry already presupposes the lawfulness out of which it expects everything to unfold. And that's not the whole story, basically. So, this is now fully fleshed out, but we're not yet aware, where are these elements that's containing this? So here's what I just did. And I can use the same Perl principle I did before and generate a whole field, actually now a space of cubic shapes, all lawfully related to the same original, like a seed crystal. And what's really important to point out now is that we have, well, at the risk of sounding dualistic, I do want to point out 2 elements. We have this, the form, and we have these 3 points, which together are defining a plane, which we have to realize now is co-emergent with this form. Right? We cannot have a form such as this without this plane existing in some degree, usually in our peripheral awareness, actually to the point of unconscious. So now, what happens then if one of those points moves to infinity? We have this example, and we have now the ability to spread out in equal intervals in this direction, left and right. Although again, that point out there and this point out here are the same. And we see now what has happened to the plane that has generated this. It has now gone out to infinity as well. This triangle, this is a triangle now, still a triangle, it's 3 points. But now it's a funny looking triangle. Okay, let's go to the next level of infinity. Now we've taken that point that was here and thrust it north, up, or down, whichever you prefer, because it's the same point. And we now have this capacity. So this is a more true rendition of linear perspective because of the ability now that we recognize as verticality and parallel horizontality. And yet we still have the vanishing point. And I drew this up there just because I could. I couldn't have done that before without the uniformity of this field allowing for the ability to measure. Right? All I had to do was take this interval and bring it up. Same thing over there. So we can see now by locating elements at infinity, that's what makes measurement possible. Measurement and the measurability, or a measurable world, isn't original, it's not primary, it's an outcome of certain geometric assumptions. But it's really powerful because then you can just draw stuff like that. Couldn't have done that before. And now this gives us the capacity to control space in a sense, to abstract space in its entirety. So again, going back to this image, we see that all the pillars are vertical, or they all meet at a point at infinity. And also the horizontal lines are parallel, but we still have a single vanishing point. So you're still here located in space, very specifically, in 3 axes. But now, what happens if we take that point and disappear it, such as that? Now, this point that was on our vanishing horizon line is now, they're all parallel, and so it's at infinity, and we have this cube, or a abstracted version of a cube. You don't ever really see it like this. So now we can recall the coordinates and add the 3rd dimension, the z dimension, and realize that, again, what this is the projection of these units, these cubes, that are all structured on those infinite elements. But now, we are no longer present in it. There's no more expansion and contraction. There's no more relationship. We are just extricated, sort of, from this field, and hence can't find our way in it. So let's go back to some of these ideas of Gebser's. So we mentioned before systasis, but what is that exactly? It's the conjoining or fitting together of parts into integrality. A categorical element is the integrating dimension by which the 3-dimensional spatial world, which is always a world of parts, is integrated into a whole in such a way that it can be stated. So at the risk, again, of over mythologizing the symbols I'm trying to work with here, we can see that these parts, all these different units, when we separate the presence of infinity, we only see those parts. And to see the whole and to engage in this mentioning activity, we have to recognize that there are these other elements that are present with the cube. Now, we have a conclusion. There's two things on my conclusion. First of all, the question could be raised, is this a picture of the aperspectival world? And my sense is that no, it is not. Because even though it is bringing to presence both the form and the effective elements on the periphery, we would have the same geometry in the perfectly regular Cartesian cubic world. The aperspectival geometry arises when you participate in the activity that's unfolding here. So this is one of any number of perspectives that we could take on the elements of form and space. And so my sense is that the aperspectival world is not one that you could conceptualize or schematize, which unfortunately has been generally the history of non-Euclidean projective geometry in the last several hundred years. It's been just rationalized, and very little of this sort of imaginary quality has escaped it. But what's it going with that? Well, maybe I have more point. The other final thought I want to leave you with is a task, actually. How do you practice this? How do you bring this presence of infinite elements to awareness? Well, you have a lot of material at your disposal. Look around you. Rectilinearity is everywhere. It's beneath you, it's above you, it's on all sides. So my exercise, what I like to do is to look at these things, to see them, and to try to bring to awareness, okay, these lines are extending to infinity. Okay, there's an infinite plane of space that's involving and effecting the shape that I'm seeing form. And sort of a way to bring that home again is to picture this. So here's a cube with the lines that would and should be parallel were it be a perfect cube, such as this. Now I've taken the lines that define that cube and extend them, but I've brought them together because that's what they would do if they were at infinity. They would intersect. But now, if we put this idea into this idea, which is to say that this sphere is the infinite sphere bounding, it's a plane bounding all space. And when it is there, it's no longer curved, it's perfectly flat. And whichever direction you look at it, it will appear perpendicular to your line of vision, whether it's here or it's here. Okay? So there's no curving, and yet it appears this way and it appears that way. Another paradox. So if we imagine then that this cube sits in here, and that when this sphere becomes infinitely large, then and only then would these points that are seemingly curved would appear as they do straight. And we would then have our fundamental cubic unit. Our problem is we don't think about this at all, totally unaware of that presence, and we just live in this world. And we design our spaces according to this unit, this part, neglecting the whole. So as a consequence, we structure our world to reify this inability to connect with the space around us. So on the one hand, I think the exercise is to bring to presence, as you look at the space around you, the effective elements at infinity. And just don't use right angles. I mean, just cut some corners here and there, literally. I guess that's all. Might there be any questions? I'm going to bring back these.
I have a playful question.
Sure.
Was Apollonius's concept of the asymptote at all influential in your? Does that form part of your thinking about this?
Not mine, no, but he did a lot of work with conic sections.
Yeah.
And one of the first projective geometers, Gerard Desargues and Blaise Pascal, he basically established all of what Apollonius did without using the same Euclidean postulates. So that any circle, ellipse, or conic section are just variations on the same fundamental thing, just seen from different perspectives.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I enjoyed this, and I'd love to see you take it further using the geometry of the vortex, since, you know, everything is in motion, and indeed everything is traveling in vortectical spirals at the large scale. You know, the Earth is not rotating like this, it's rotating in, you know, various vortices within vortices. So I think that could be a cool extension of this. And the other thing I'd just like to bring up was a couple of years ago at the Monterey Games, Steve Rosen gave a talk on the Klein surface, and it's a non-orientable surface as another way to get into the conversation about perspectivity and non-perspectivity.
But where I like to go with this, when I can, is into the realm of biology and natural form. Because once we break ourselves from this attraction or constraining situation of the prison of a Cartesian world, we can open up to the possibilities of new geometric relationships, patterns, and processes that are actually then more resonant with the geometry we find in nature. So nature doesn't measure, and yet geometry. But there's a lot. This is just scratching the surface. I think the whole world of physics, cosmology, and basically everything we think about the world is predicated on geometric assumptions about a measurable, quantifiable space. So you take that away, the world will arise in a whole new way. So there's a lot to be discovered.
I may have mentioned this to you in email, but the other part of my work, which is outside the Gibson Society, is my research into Hermetic philosopher Strawn. And he was actually a geometer. He did all his work with the sacred geometry of the Egyptian temples. He studied for 15 years on site. But anyway, he, in his Hermetic metaphysics, he does, it just struck me the image you posted where you get the triangle up top, creating this sort of fourfold form down below.
Right.
And he had this idea that, well, in alchemy and mysticism, you got the idea that the tree of primo, with the three primaries, which create the world of four elements. And
Salt, sulfur, mercury.
yeah, sulfur, mercury, and salt are the kind of generators, the metaphysical generators in a sense of the four elements.
Yeah.
And you've got some diagrams and stuff like that to demonstrate this. But no, that's a very interesting correlation.
All right.
For me, at least.
Another path to take. I'm excited.
Yeah.
Keeps unfolding. Matt, you have a question?
Just a comment that you've brought to my attention the fact that while measurement falsifies time, it also falsifies space, concrete space, lived space, and that we have as much work to do to free our conceptions of space from this obsession with measurement as we do to free time. So I appreciate. It's nice that our talks kind of balance one another in that.
Something.
Yeah.
Just basically what you finished up with, your injunction to build with fewer right angles. I'd be surprised if anybody in this room is actually living in a structure that they themselves built. And I'm just like, a lot of the martial arts work I've been doing the last few years involves meeting straight lines with curved surfaces and circular movement. And I'm just curious about, as an individual and as a human being, being able to alter personal perspective in order to inhabit the measured spaces differently.
Yeah, it seems a necessity.
Yeah.
Although it would be nice if space could kind of work a little bit, you know. Designers could sort of meet us halfway. But yeah, there's a lot.
I just want to bring up a man's name who keeps coming up in this room today, and that's Alan Watts. You know, Watts wrote quite a bit about this subject of our tendency to want to put a grid on the world and build everything at right angles, and that's not how nature actually works. He wrote quite eloquently about this whole idea of the damage that we do by projecting a rectilinear system on the world.
Okay. Well, at the risk of making a fool of myself, I don't know enough about Alan Watts, but this quote is sort of referring in a way to that popular notion that, yeah, the rectilinearity is this grid-like way is to be shunned or to be retracted from, not involved in that. But then what are we left with? I mean, how is science going to continue to move forward or even get beyond the rational structure if we just retreat?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't,
So how do we-
actually, as a scientist, I would say there's tremendous value in, looking at the world through that grid, the discretization and the ability to create structures like this. And so it's not like you throw that out or you dismiss it. You essentially are looking at it in a relative sense rather than an absolute sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a related question, and I'm kind of out of my depth here since I'm a poet who flunked geometry in 10th grade, and maybe that gives me an advantage in terms of getting to the Aperspectival, since I was too stupid to. But so for a lot of Platonism related to Pythagoras' notion of number and the magic of numerical relationship. And I'm wondering if what you're outlining here in terms of how space has been reified, is that a logical conclusion of the Greek imagination of number and mathematics, or is the original Pythagorean Platonic notion of number and incipient geometry, is that something that in and of itself has a capacity to open up to very differently imagined, more mystically open notions of space and reality? You know, understand the question?
Yeah, and that often comes up when I try to tell people what I'm doing, because most people associate it with Pythagorean or sacred geometry. And I have to frequently try to distinguish the two. And my sense is that that geometry is still very much sort of efficient mental. You know, it retains the presence of numinous. You know, the sacred geometry is often numinous geometry. And as Gebser describes, numinosity actually falls away when we move towards integrality. It doesn't, we have the quote handy, but because it's transparency, not numinosity. And so to me, this is a different avenue of geometry, and that that geometry might be a part of the sort of larger integral project of how do we then bring them efficient mental, or even maybe more of the mythical geometry to bear. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think a lot of that geometry is still sort of bound to measurement and ratio. Golden ratio is still a ratio. Structures are often designed with ratios in mind.
Mostly referring back to music, and talking about kind of the string and the path at certain intervals to create that harmonic sequence and then scale that comes out.
But
Yeah.
I think for something to the effect of music is ratio or number in time, and geometry is number in space, or architecture perhaps. So he brought it all back to number. This is a kind of what projective geometry does is kind of get beyond number, beyond counting or measuring. Okay, maybe this will be the last one.
So in 10th grade geometry, I began doing very well at the beginning. And by the middle of the semester, I was doing poorly. One day, the teacher was going down the rows asking us, what do we want to do when we grow up? And as my turn came, I said I wanted to be an engineer. And he said, have you considered farming? I was very upset by this at the time, no longer. And my real question is, if we move past measurability as a way of recognizing validity or legitimacy, where do we land? Is there a one or two word way of characterizing that basis for validity, legitimacy, value?
I think I'm inclined to say that it necessitates the development of a new organ of perception, just as we have the heart and the head. And if you look at Gebser's charts, what's there as the new organ? It's just blank.
It's like wholeness. Wholeness.
The organ is wholeness?
Yeah. Wholeness in the field. I mean, I sense that. That's what I live, is that I am part of the field and I sense it all. So you could take solar plexus, heart, third eye, different throat center, and each of those are an intuition, awareness, but then there's like a whole awareness in the field that I would identify with Gebser's integrality and a new organ. I don't know. I mean, that's my thinking.
Yeah, and
Not only my thinking, my acting.
the kind of awareness that is born when you start to recognize these elements that arise without measurement, the sort of phenomenological approach to the geometric unfolding, that, to me, builds that organ of perception. And it's that which will be what we need to continue to operate effectively beyond measurable headbound thinking.
Just one last quick thing. I thought it was quite cute because in my history of mathematics, I thought geometry started with farming in the fields in Egypt, right? Where they would flood every year and they would have to measure them out. Am I wrong? Or does it go back before that?
Geometry literally is to measure the land.
Yeah. Right.
Which is a word that doesn't apply here.